Cool. So let me know if anything's blocking anything. Oh, and also, I know I'll keep on reposting this because if you come in a little bit late, oh, I just posted it straight to one person. Okay, so if you to every if you come in and you're late, check the PowerPoint, the PDFs on this slide. Cool. So today's class is about internalizations and biases. So the last two classes we talked about, kind of defining racism, defining it, yes, like racism, can be explicit racism. It can be, white supremacists and stuff like that. But a lot of the racism that we're actually dealing with in this country on a daily basis is systemic. It's a lot of systems that automatically benefit, white people while exploiting people, Black, Indigenous people of color. All these systems, they're automatic. They're very often race neutral. They may seem, not racist, but the outcomes are very racist outcomes. So that's like one side, one part of the racism. The other part is we're all born into these systems, whether we like it or not. And regardless, you can be the most woke person ever, but you're still, every one of us has absorbed and internalized a lot of the culture of these systems, the white supremacy culture, the anti-Blackness culture, anti-Indigenous culture, all these different things. Same with like patriarchy, neoliberal capitalism, and all these different systems. I mean, you can't not avoid it, through our family and friends and our whitewash Eurocentric education and our just so many, our media, it just bombarding us with all these different things, and you can't not absorb it. And when we absorb it and we internalize it, and then that, connects with how we interact with the world, it creates these biases, these split-second unconscious decisions that are based many times, even though they're unconscious a lot of time, they're part of our fight or flight mechanisms. They're still based on these stereotypes and these racist beliefs that we absorb through society. So we're gonna kind of dive into that today and talk about how that comes out and how that works, and how and the history behind it, how it comes out today, and a lot of different things. So we're going to talk about internalizations and socializations, talk about the difference between stereotypes and biases, and talk about the history of stereotypes. And then dive in for a while, just all the things that the modern racial biases that we see throughout our country, and all the different ways it comes out, or at least try to name as many as possible. I mean, there's a lot. Talk about understanding our own biases. We're going to show some tools to actually help people, because a lot of these biases are unconscious. And a lot of times they're opposite of who we really want to be. We want to be these. I can see the world, as everyone's being equal, and I can see all these things happening. But at the same time, these biases, if I'm not conscious about it and trying to dismantle them, I mean, it comes out exactly opposite of who I'm trying to be. So talk about like microaggressions, and then like the biggest, one of the biggest, barriers to actually, tackling a lot of these biases and dismantling a lot of these systems that produce these biases is the anti-PC movement, which we'll talk more about that as well. We probably won't get to that today. I'll probably get halfway through the presentation and I'll record the rest of the week. But I definitely recommend check that out, because that was one of the most surprising things when I was doing my research, because just the history of the PC movement is some sinister evil stuff that it's just, I don't know, hopefully, please check it out, because it's important. Not to say that we all need to be working on better ways to calling out and calling in people and all that stuff, but at the same time, it's really an evil movement. Or just about, I don't say evil, but there's a history that we should understand behind the creation of PC culture. And then dehumanization, we'll talk about that, cultural appropriation, and then the last, have a couple slides about the N word. Cool. All right. So the first slide, first section, we're going to talk about internalizations and socializations. So these, I mean, a lot of times these two words can be, used, interchangeably. You'll still get the message across, but there's slight differences. Like socialization is a lot where how we socialize, people in our society, whether like especially new people in our society, whether it's children or immigrants, and how we socialize them to adopt the norms and culture that we have. Unfortunately, a lot of our norms and culture are around like white supremacy and patriarchy and things like that. So they're socialized into this stuff from education, media, family, friends, circles, all that stuff. And then the internalizations are the things that we kind of absorb and we carry with us, and then a lot of times they're very unintentional, they're very unconscious, but they come out in our biases and in attitudes and perceptions. So I'm going to play this from Race Works. It talks a little bit about how the cultural cycle and how all of this stuff kind of absorbs into us.
How do people do race in society? The culture cycle is a tool that helps us map this out. Race operates across different levels of society: the individual level, the interactional level, the institutional level, and the ideological level. These levels can be represented in a useful tool called the culture cycle. Let's take a look at each level to see how it contributes to how we do race. When people think about race, they often start at the individual level. People's thoughts, feelings, beliefs, biases, and stereotypes about race and racial difference. But where do these beliefs and biases come from? First, people learn about race and racial difference through their interactions with other people, like family, friends, teachers, and police officers, and with products in society, like social media, TV, film, and advertisements. People and products communicate and transmit ideas about race and racial difference. Next, social institutions formalize or institutionalize ideas about race and racial difference through current and past laws, policies, rules, and norms. Some powerful institutions of the past, like slavery and segregation, continue to influence how race functions today. Finally, ideas or ideologies about race and racial difference are part of our culture and are shaped by our history. These are the cultural stories people tell about why some racial groups are supposedly superior or inferior to others. And these ideas are built into our world through institutions and interactions, which in turn shape how individuals think, feel, and act. Individuals then either reinforce or resist what's in the world around them, feeding back into the cycle. These four levels continually interact and dynamically influence one another. The culture cycle can be used to map how we do race and help us see where we can work to start to undo racism. So this useful tool, the culture cycle, shows us how race operates across different levels of society and how those levels interact with one another.
All right. I think that one of the most important takeaways of the cultural cycle is that it is a cycle. It is circular. It's hard to find a starting point or an ending point, and we're going to talk more about this like many times, like the ideas create this, can create the policies that create the racist outcomes that create, reinforces the racist ideas that reinforce, creates more policies. So it is very circular. We will try and dive a little bit more deeper into that. But I want to just throw out a couple kind of really great definitions about internalizations and socializations when it comes to racial. Dismantling racism, I can't speak just enough how amazing this website is if you're looking for some really great resources around racism. But they define racial internalizations. Racism not only impacts us personally, culturally, institutionally, racism also operates on us mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. When racism targets us, we internalize that targeting. And when racism benefits us, we internalize that privileging. And then racial socialization. Chasa Lasan Brown writes really great article about the how we socialize race in this country. But she writes, race socialization is defined as specific verbal and nonverbal messages transmitted to younger generations for the development of values, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs regarding the meaning and significance of race and racial stratification, intergroup and intra-group interactions, and personal and group identity. So she really focuses on the socialization often happens with the younger people, and then they internalize that and they bring those internalizations with them, throughout their life. So kind of dive a little bit deeper. I mean, to really understand, internalizations and racial bias, we need to kind of separate, explicit racism from implicit racism. And explicit racism is something that, many people are very familiar with. It's very in your face, easy to see racism, like the KKK, Jim Crow, Trump, with a lot of his tweets and policies, using the N-word. But a lot of time though, we have to understand that a lot of times with explicit racism, the people actually perpetuating this oftentimes don't feel like they're being racist, and that's important to understand that that intent versus impact. That like I think about Washington Redskins. I mean, thank goodness that they're going to change the name, but after so long, and that name, I mean, you can't. It's just Native mascots is a very racist, thing that dehumanizes Native Americans, and also, and it just perpetuates violence, against Native Americans by the, continuing the dehumanization and colonial beliefs, and it's just like the mental impact of it. I mean, it's a racist thing, but most, because we normalize racism, especially against Indigenous people, we really normalize this racism, anti-Indigenous racism. That I would say most of the people, sports fans, most of the Washington Redskins fans never saw it as a racist thing, so it's important to understand that even though they're not being intentional, but they're still explicitly supporting something that's racist, and it doesn't matter if they see it as racist or not. Trump, thinks he's the most he thinks he's the most non-racist person in the country. That doesn't mean that it's racism is any less racist. So explicit racism, regardless if it's with the intent, or regardless if they understand it's racism, it's still just the explicit, easy to see, very intentional things that we do that create racist outcomes. And on the other side, the implicit racism. So this is more about this is more of the unintentional. I mean, you can have intentional, implicit racism, but when most of it's very unintentional, it's very unconscious. We don't know that we're doing it. A lot of times, like explicit racism is more about like the stereotypes, that we see, like the Native mascots, and then the implicit racism is like when we internalize that, and then we create these anti-Indigenous biases, towards Native Americans from growing up, with these racist mascots. So a lot of times it's very intentional. It's hard to see. It's a lot of it's inside of ourselves. A lot of it's just like biases and attitudes and kind of direct results of growing up in a white supremacy society. I think the best thing to really understand implicit bias, or racial implicit racism is really a lot of this comes down to that frontal lobe of your brain. I can't remember the name of it, but it's that's in charge of our fight or flight mechanism. Because like it's developed a long time ago when prehistoric times when we when our brains were just bombarded by so many different outside stimuli, and sometimes we can't process everything. We just don't have time, and sometimes it's dangerous to sit around and you see like a saber-toothed tiger coming towards you. You're not going to sit around and being like, is this dangerous? What should I do? Let me calculate my that's when your frontal lobe, the fight or flight, takes over. You instantly fight or you instantly run, and that's done in the snap of fingers. That part of the brain just takes over. It's been storing all the things that you've learned throughout your life, the things that are dangerous, the things that are safe, and it makes snap judgments. To basically, to protect yourself, But I mean, fast forward now to modern society. I mean, there's still dangerous moments and things that we need fight or flight. For the most part, we don't need necessarily need that. We have time for most of our situations. We have time to start thinking about things, but that doesn't mean that frontal lobe ever shut off. It's still working to the point where it absorbs all these stereotypes and from media and absorbs it in you. And then when it perceives some kind of danger, it makes a snap judgment for you, and it doesn't matter. A lot of times it's not where you want to be. It's again, but it still unconsciously does that. For example, a big stereotype in this country is this myth that it's this black criminality myth that black people are just predispositioned to be violent and criminals, and that we'll talk more about that came from the need to continue to control them through white supremacy after slavery was over. So they created all these black criminality myths to justify the violence that was used to control free black people. But that we never got rid of that built a criminal justice system. It built a media, it's part of it's ingrained in our society, this anti-blackness, black criminality myth. So we're absorbing all this stuff, and that frontal lobe storing all those images, all the things that it learns, through media, through our school, through our parents, all these things. And then, you're walking down the alleyway and a black person, is suddenly coming, and even if you don't feel, it's that snap of judgment. This person's dangerous, so I'm going to, pull tight my purse. I'm going to cross the street. If I'm in the car, I'm going to hit the lock button. So it's these snap, these like snap moments, and that plays out even more dangerously in interactions, with like police. Oftentimes when police talk about using, force, using violence, they have to be able to justify that they felt like, there was some kind of danger to themselves or others. And these, these cops are just like all of us. They're born in these society. They absorb all these stereotypes, particularly about black criminality, and then they put on a uniform and get a gun and then they have to make these snap judgments when they decide if a situation's dangerous enough to use force. I mean, that again, that's a snap of fingers. That's not some equation they're doing in their head. There's not some thing. I mean, it's like a snap of fingers, and they make that judgment. And that frontal lobe, who has been absorbing all that black criminality myths, is going to basically create a different outcome for black people and white people and during those moments. And that's true with if I'm trying to decide who I'm going to hire or who I'm going to give interviews. If that's true if see a black person walk in my store and I'm going to, am I going to, follow them around and harass them? So it comes out in so many different ways, this unconsciousness. And yes, I'm not, and it's important to also understand, I'm not, even though it's unconscious, we're still responsible for it. Just because it's unconscious doesn't mean that it's a free pass. It just means that we need to, all of us, because we've all absorbed this, we all need to spend time learning about our biases and actively trying to counter our biases as well. So yeah, definitely, even though it's unconscious, we are still very much responsible for our racial biases. And also, yeah, so that, comes out in a variety of different ways, whether our criminal justice system, whether, police decides to pull someone over, arrest them, shoots them, uses brutality, the racial bias, affects that, whether juries are convicting black defendants, whether, judges give longer sentences, whether they punish black children receive more, black boys receive 3 times as more, punishment and brutality and expulsion in schools. Black girls actually receive 6 times as much. You know, and that plays into all, you know, the administrator and teachers deciding, is this kid, you know, is he a child that I'm going to give a second chance, or am I going to treat him like an adult and, you know, and call the police, you know? So, you know, like how doctors come out and how microaggressions, you know, we're going to talk, we have a whole section on microaggressions, but these are just like, you know, very subtle things that we say that comes out, like telling a, black person, they speak really good English, you know, like, you know, which is crazy, but I've seen this, you know, happen in a lot of my workplaces, you know, and like, it's like, you know, if a black person speaks up in a staff meeting, you know, some older white person will compliment how great they speak, you know, like, just so these are all like, biases that come out and kind of, based on these stereotypes of how we perceive the world. Same with like political parties, like the political right has been using what we call dog whistles, you know, where they tap in directly into those biases when they use what's with our dog whistles, like when they say law and order, you know, law and order was created as a way to kind of like Nixon created that, you know, to basically crack down and brutalize civil rights activists. And we still see that today when people, you know, when we're cracking down on a lot of the anti-police brutality protests, you know, we'll see people, you mentioned law and order and things, because they want to tap into that bias, that racial bias that people have, you know, states' rights and you know, things like that. I think one of the biggest ones, for me at least, you know, well, for racial bias is, is this belief into this meritocracy and this like system justifications and stuff, which I've talked about before. But like, I'm thinking about, like, I grew up in the, like a very white, you know, Ohio steel town. And I found out later it was a sundown town, which sundown towns are, there's been thousands of sundown towns, thanks to like James Lowen, who's this author, has been researching this. But after, you know, the slavery ended, you know, Black people were trying to escape the Jim Crow South, so they went all over the North and the West, and in response, all these towns thousands of them became sundown towns, where they basically just ethnically cleansed themselves of new Black people, and then they created laws like, you know, Black people can't be out, around past, you know, sundown, which became, you know, named Sundown Town. But basically, the direct result is these towns are still very white today. It was a very white experience growing up. And, you know, I had a lot of, like, you know, openly racist friends, you know, who had openly racist parents, and they talked all, you know, and they believed things like, you know, Black people were lazy and abusing this, you know, welfare systems, and were criminals, and we needed to over police. And they believed all these things, which, I mean, my family didn't. We were, I mean, we weren't anti-racist. We were more like the non-racist category, where we didn't, you know, push these like explicit racist beliefs. But at the same time, we believed in meritocracy. We believed in this idea that this country was the same, you know, or this country is like a fair country, that, you know, like, and so I took those beliefs and I looked at the world like, you know, most of the wealth is in white people's hands, so that means white people must work harder. You know, Black people are living in my town, living in poverty, so they must not work so hard. You know, like police, you know, counters with police were all great. So I figured, you know, when I heard about police brutality, there must have been something, you know, done to invoke that, you know, police brutality, or like homeless people are lazy, or like, you know, protesters are ungrateful. So I came to these own conclusions myself, and it's crazy, like, when you think about it, like my friends who are taught these like explicitly racist things, came to the same like outcomes as I did, just by not being taught explicit racism, but being taught like meritocracy. Like, we both came to the same outcomes, that, you know, Black communities need to be over policed, that we don't need reparations and all these things. So it's, you know, it's important to understand that a lot of this implicit racism, it doesn't have to come from these like really harmful stereotypes. A lot of times it could just become from these false beliefs, like that we live in a meritocracy. All right, and I really love this. I really love this slide. I've shown it a couple of times. It's been added to over the years. But I think this is the newest one. But I really like it. He does a great job breaking apart, you know, explicit racism or overt racism, and covert. You know, explicit, you know, lynching, hate crimes, you know, neo-Nazis, burning crosses, you know, all explicit things. But then implicitly or covert, you know, calling the police on Black people, you know, white silence, you know, tone policing, blaming the victim, you know, denial of racism, all these things that, they may not be explicitly in your face, but they're still, they're still perpetuating a lot of these Black stereotypes and false narratives and anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous culture. Cool. And at the same time, we need to understand that a lot of times we break apart implicit racism and systemic, and we kind of just focus on one, and that never really ends very well. For example, like whenever people are trying to reform police, the first like go-to they go is let's give them implicit bias training. Or if they're trying to reform, some racism at workplaces, let's just bring, implicit bias trainings. And those are good, don't get me wrong, but when they're just by themselves, they're not that effective, because for police, yeah, it's great. Let's help them understand their implicit bias and how it affects their split decisions, split second decisions. But if we're not also dismantling the racist structures of policing, like the fact that if there was a cop that wanted to report another cop's brutality or racism or corruption, there's no real way for that to do that. I'm going to talk about, we're going to have a whole class on policing, and we're going to talk about all the infrastructure that's there that creates racist outcomes. And one of them is the fact that there's been a bunch of whistleblowing cops, in the last 2 decades, but the things that have happened to them have just been horrific. They don't get promotions, they get fired, they get thrown in the worst, they get the worst shifts, they don't get back up. Some of them have been killed, just for being whistleblowers. So if we're not dismantling these structures, that racial bias isn't going to do a whole lot. So that's important that we understand that the implicit racism and systemic racism, they're directly linked. I'm going to read this quote by a National Equity Project. Making progress on equity will require us to both mitigate our own biases and change structures. For example, structure inequities in the way we fund our public schools means that students living in affluent communities, most often majority white, attend highly resourced schools with extensive opportunities for deep learning and extracurricular activities, while students living in neighborhoods in which we have disinvested, often majority people of color, attend schools that are underfunded with fewer academic and extracurricular activities. When these students underperform, the fact of their underperformance reinforces our conscious and implicit stereotypes about their intelligence, the extent to which their parents value education, they do in their effort. This is an insidious cycle whereby the structural inequities produce inequitable outcomes, which then reinforce harmful stereotypes about students of color. And then students living in poverty, in which are then used to justify inequitable practices such as holding low expectations, academic tracking, and punitive discipline in schools. So this is the idea that, there's been a lot of studies lately that just show just how much more we fund white schools. And it's attuned to hundreds of billions a year. I think that the average white student gets an extra $700 to $1,000 per student. So, I mean, it's just, and on top of that, racial segregation also, holds a lot of the best, resources and economic opportunities in white neighborhoods, while concentrating in poverty and non-white neighborhoods. So, so when we look at schools, I mean, we oftentimes we underfund schools. Just a second. So we underfund schools, and then the outcomes is that these schools, perform less. So then people can look at that and think all kinds of racist things, Black children just don't care enough about education, or they're not trying hard enough, or there's just, and that's where the idea of achievement gap, a lot of people are really pushing back against the achievement gap, because what the achievement gap does is it kind of says everyone's on the same plane, and we're just going to assess, who's performing the best. And at the same time, we're going to use assessment tools that have been founded by eugenists. A lot of these achievement tests, SATs and stuff were created by eugenists to prove, they're racially biased tests that are created to prove that white people were more intelligent. So that kind of dictates all these racist ideas, and then that creates even more perpetuation, like No Child Left Behind. I started teaching right when that was implemented, and that basically just punished schools that weren't doing well on their performance tests. So they gave them even less funding, they created even worse results, and it was just a continuation of a cycle. Like I think about a lot of times when we think about these disinvested communities, you know, like this also rings true with like policing decisions. Like one of the biggest predictors of crime is poverty, and it's not race related at all. You throw any race into a poverty situation, and because of the lack of economic opportunities, they're going to do what they need to do to survive, which oftentimes if there's no legal way to survive, they're going to find other ways. And so so a lot of times we see, oh, look at this poor community, Black community, let's over police them to try to fix the crime problem, and then then we get all kinds of data about how there's an enormous amount of crime, a lot of times because we're focusing on that, and then we use that data to get more funding to over police them even more, which creates even more horrific situations, more poverty, and then creates more crime, and then it's just this continuing cycle where eventually we're at where most of our cities are at, where we're like paying half of our budget to police these communities instead of just like investing in them and building from them. So that's long story how like these things kind of like these racial these systems produce these racist outcomes, which kind of reinforces this racial bias, as creates more racial policies, racist policies. So I'll read John Powell. He wrote, biases not only affect our perceptions, but our policies, policies and institutional arrangements. Therefore, these biases influence the types of outcomes we see across a variety of contexts: school, labor, housing, health, criminal justice systems, and so forth. These racialized outcomes subsequently reinforce the very stereotypes and prejudice that initially influence the stratified outcomes. Cool. All right, and then we talked a lot about this already, but these a big internalization just that a big internalization that a lot of us internalize is we do live in a white supremacy society, which values whiteness and values the norms and what's good and what's normal and beautiful is all around white, and then opposite of all that is from non-white. We read Crossroads Anti-Racism. It has a good definition. Internalized racist superiority is complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, and or live out superior societal definitions of self, and to fit into and live out superior societal roles. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, white supremacy. So as we talked about in last class, white supremacy culture is all about making the normal and the good, white. If you Google, beautiful women, you're going to see tons of pictures of white women. If you Google, unprofessional haircut, you're going to see tons of pictures of Black haircuts. And I see a lot of white people who argue that, they say, well, all of us have to, be professional. All of us have to, you can't just give Black people a pass. But but that's not the question. It's not about giving anyone a pass. It's about understanding that our standard of professionalism is based on white haircuts and white, culture, white clothes, white culture. It's all based on that. And it's based on beauty. It's about being white, being, professionalism is about, it's not about giving anyone a free pass. It's about creating our standards, professionalism standards on multiple cultures and multiple definitions of what professionalism looks like. White people maybe having dreads isn't considered professionalism, but a lot of other cultures having dreads are very professional. So it's about kind of opening it up, and not just having that one standard, based on whiteness. And a lot of examples of internalized white superiority. So we've talked to some of this already, so I won't spend too much time, but we talked about how this idea that my worldview is the universal view. So a lot of white people think that the way they interact with the world and experience that world, everyone else experiences it the same way. So when they hear something that doesn't click with them, they attack it or deny it rather than just listening to it and understanding there's not everyone experiences the world that we do. I have the right to be comfortable, and the real problem is the people that make me uncomfortable, not about, you know, the actual systems that people are talking about, that are oppressing people. You know, if I have good intentions or I'm nice, I can't be racist. You know, that's a big one. Like, you know, if I mean well, I can't, you know, I can't be racist. But really, racism is about outcomes. It's not about intentions. Oh, and then on the other side of this, on you know, white supremacy culture is what it means for people who are not white to grow up in the white supremacy culture. And I think about that, that first video, that first James Baldwin video that we played in our first class. And how, you know, he just did such a good job talking about how when he was a little kid, he suddenly realized that, you know, that the flag that he was, you know, pledging his allegiance to wasn't pledging allegiance back. He realized when he was rooting for Gary Cooper and all these like white cowboys that, you know, played in shows where they killed, you know, savage natives. He was rooting for, you know, those white people, when in reality he realized he was actually he was belonged to the non-white group. And what that must mean to really, you know, not have your history taught, or to, you know, or do have your history just be whitewashed, and just so the idea, like, so internalized racist, you know, oppression. Again, dismantling racism does a really great job, a really great page talking about this stuff. But they define it as internalizations by people of color of racist image, stereotypes, prejudice, actions, and messaging promoted by white supremacist culture. So it affects thoughts and feelings about oneself, one's racial group, and other Black, Indigenous people of color. So it's just about all the, you know, growing up in a society that says everything about you and your culture is wrong, you know, just like what that means, and how that means about your feelings towards yourself, your feelings to your community, your feelings to your race. So, and that's really important to kind of understand, not just like, you know, you know, the white version of white supremacy, but also, you know, what it means for everyone else. And I'm going to play a clip by Dee Watts Jones, and she's going to talk a little bit more about this internalized racism.
The language around internalized racism varies. People use that term differently. There are some people who talk about internalized racism as representing both a process by which whites have internalized their superiority, and people of color have internalized their inferiorities. So it's the same term for both of those experiences, which are obviously very different. I tend to use the term internalized racism to represent the experience of people of color who have internalized the racism from society. Essentially, what that means is that the proponents of racism and all the variety of ways in which it's exacted speak to or insist upon the inferiority of people of color. And so when you've internalized that, that means that you have internalized to some degree that you are inferior. As a marginalized, subjugated person, your character, your integrity is under attack. So the last thing you want to do is to acknowledge that, in fact, you have internalized some of that, because that just makes you more vulnerable. But as part of the healing, it needs to come up. It needs to come out. But it can only happen in a safe place. So that is where a within group process, and by within group, what I mean is with people who share the same identity, whether that's the same race or same class, are together to be able to talk without worrying about feeling that you are now sharing a vulnerability with people who have benefited from your oppression. But you can find now that Black people are much more comfortable in talking about skin color and the ways in which lighter skin is often privileged in the Black community as well as in the white community. And that's because I think some of the shame of that has been healed. And that as that shame gets healed, people are freer to talk about it because they're not feeling that shame about that anymore. It's as if the more you can begin to talk about the ways in which you have been wounded by racism, the more you're able to understand and really feel clear that that shame is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. That what has happened and what is happening is shameful. And then it makes it easier for you to actually talk about it across racial groups.
Okay, and so one of the biggest takeaways I wanted to kind of pull from this is when she was talking about the spaces that a lot of Black Indigenous people of color who need to heal, that they need to be non-white spaces, and that's really important, especially for the white people to understand that that healing from white supremacy isn't, something that we can be a part of. It's not some white saviorism thing that we're going to help. You shouldn't, start talking to your Black friends about healing. This is something that needs to happen in non-white spaces. And I know a lot of times white people will get offended when they hear non-white spaces like that, but it's super important to understand that healing cannot happen when literally like the status of who we are is causing that harm. So it's really important. I've been noticing a lot of racism groups, a lot of anti-racism groups that are really focused on processing will actually have segregated groups where they'll have white people and white, anti-racism groups, and then non-white. And then that's for two reasons. One is like a lot of times for white people to really understand what's going on, especially internally, what we absorb, a lot of times a lot of ugliness has to come up, a lot of things that, and so if there's Black people in the room that they're gonna experience, that it's not, it doesn't always work out. And then it's another time, like as I was saying, white people can't be a part of that healing space as well for Black people. So that needs to be, so I just want to kind of throw that out there and just kind of let people understand that when you hear, certain spaces are for Black only, that's not the same as like hearing certain spaces are for white only. There's really purpose and intention around Black only spaces to make comfort zones and healing zones as we live in a literal white supremacy country. Oh. And another big internalization I want to talk about is individualizing white negativity versus generalizing Black negativity. So what this looks like is when white people do things, whether good or bad, it's always seen as like an individual accomplishment, as opposed to when Black people do things like good or bad, it's a representation of the whole race. For example, if like a white terrorist shoots up a bunch of people, instantly you see in the media, oh, it's a lone wolf, it's a troubled kid. It's all about its individual choices, as opposed to when like, let's say like a Muslim, terrorist, does something bad. That's all of a sudden indication of the whole group of Muslims are part of violence or they're a violent religion. It's never just an individual Muslim. It's always about this whole group. Or if a Black person commits a crime, it's never about that individual person. He was just a troubled person. It's always about representation of Black criminality, and that's all. And on the flip side, that's always also about white about accomplishments as well. When white people accomplish things, it's always about it's because of their own perseverance and their individualness overcoming it. And a lot of times when Black people or Black Indigenous people of color accomplish stuff, a lot of white people will feel like it's because of affirmative action or some unfair advantage or something like that. So and this helps to kind of perpetuate and reinforce a lot of stereotypes that we're dealing with today. So read this, Ibram Kendi, negative behavior by any Black person became proof of what was wrong with Black people, while negative behavior by any white person only proved what was wrong with that person. So I see a couple comments. So Cassie writes, Surge DC has a lot of resources for healing around white supremacy plus racism for white people, including a healing circle this Thursday in the next few weeks. Definitely. Thank you, Cassie. Yeah, and that's important because I think a lot of people, especially a lot of people are like, a lot of people are, they say that they hear about, healing from whiteness, what do white people have to do to heal? But in reality, like this is a really important thing to kind of heal from a lot of the white internalizations. And you do this so you could become a better, advocate to start dismantling the greater systems. And yeah, Surge does a lot of great stuff. Their healing circles are really fantastic. I did a course with Sandra Kim. She started the Everyday Feminism online media platform. There's like a 2-day webinar. She has online healing from whiteness or programs. I definitely recommend checking that out. it's these powerful workshops, and you'll be such a better advocate, if you actually do your own work, and actually realize, because when we say healing from white supremacy, we're understanding the internalizations we have and how that affects us and our interactions with other people. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Cassie. All right, so this is a quick video about healthcare workers. I originally had this because we're going to talk about medical biases today too, but it's just this worker does such a great job kind of explaining how the relationship between racial biases and systems. So I wanted to kind of end this section with this video real quick.
Our system is racist, and we're all participants in the system. I had a black woman come in with back pain who every time she coughed, she had chest pain, and she was just there with back pain. She would cough, oh, my chest, and she had a very histrionic personality. And so all the providers were inclined to just be like, oh, okay, let's just give her some cough medicine, give her some cough medicine. So one day I was like, let me put an EKG on you, because I think the New England Journal study just came out that Black women have the worst health outcomes with heart attacks because they're not listened to. So I'm like, okay, let me just try this. So I put an EKG on her, and every time she coughed, she had ST elevations. She was having a heart attack. I said, oh my God. So I called the cardiologist and I said, can you please cath this lady? Because I think she has a bridge artery going through her, myocardium, so that when her intrathoracic pressure is increased, it's collapsing the artery and she's having cardiac issues. And he said, well, send her to my outpatient clinic. I said, this woman will never show up to your outpatient clinic. I know this woman, I've known her for 5 years, she will never show up. She's here in the hospital, she's going to be here for a couple of days with back pain. Let's just do a cath. And he refused to do the cath. And so finally I said, I don't want this woman to become a statistic that Black women get worse medical care around heart attacks than everybody else because the medical institution doesn't listen to them. And he said, are you calling me a racist? And I said, well, I think our system is racist, and we're all participants in the system, and I'm trying to check myself. And I had to check myself and actually go, she's saying chest pain, get an EKG. Like, that's what you're trained to do. Why wasn't I doing it, right? And so I think a part of it is just starting to unlearn our own implicit biases that we've been raised with in this society, and challenge yourself with each patient encounter. Now I just challenge myself when I'm looking at Black, Indigenous, Latino person. I challenge myself, okay, what am I not seeing? What am I not asking? Because I'm a part of this system. And through that own self-inquiry and examination, I also now start, talking with my colleagues. Look what I missed.
All right. Yeah, I love that woman. She did, first of all, when she was trying to point out, the systemic racism that comes out in the medical system, I think that was a very typical white. I guarantee that doctor was white, and are you instantly went to not just talking about racial outcomes, but instantly went to, are you calling me a racist? And then because that's how our white fragility works. If you try to talk about our involvement with racist institutions or racial biases at all, our first response is, are you calling me a racist? And just this defensiveness. And I think she handled it really well. That we all live in this racist system. We all absorb this stuff, and we all are a part of it. It doesn't matter who you are, but we all need to be active participants and constantly asking ourselves and constantly examining our biases and finding out how to get past these biases, which oftentimes she talks about. You have a lot of times you need to recognize you're part of this system. We need to constantly say, what am I not seeing? What am I not doing? That I normally would do with a white patient or with a white customer or with so it's important that we constantly work on dismantling these biases. I saw a couple of people.